Welcome back, everybody, to our House Call series, From Confusion to Clarity. This is our last conversation on ethics. So, Barry, one of the most stringent measures that has been implemented during the pandemic has been these vaccines. But they're not vaccines in the traditional sense or the classical sense for two reasons. One, because they're using a very different technology, a new technology that's never been tested. And two, that they haven't been studied as thoroughly as classic traditional vaccines. We know that it takes between 10 to 15 years to develop what they would call a safe vaccine. Like, that's a long period of time. And people are saying that these vaccines have been created in warp speed. And they're right. I mean, there should be cause for concern for that. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, Paula, I'm about the furthest thing from being anti-vaxxer as you can imagine. Yeah. I've always been up to date for all my vaccines, as has my wife, my kids, my grandchildren. And I have personally either delivered or overseen the delivery of thousands or likely tens of thousands of vaccines. And I would consider vaccination probably one of the most important and useful things I've done during my career. And these new gene technologies are very exciting, and they could well be groundbreaking discoveries, not just for vaccines, for all kinds of other spin-off technologies. The trouble is, though, that they have never been able to develop a successful vaccine using this technology yet. That doesn't mean they won't be able to, it just means they haven't done so up until now. And that's why they're been released under emergency use authorization. Because on top of being a new technology, as you said earlier, they have not been studied nearly as well as most vaccines or most drugs are before they're released to all 7 billion people on the planet. So they may well be safe, but we don't know if they're safe because we actually can't know if they're safe. It just hasn't been long enough. It's going to take years before we know that. And we have to remember that once you inject these things, you can't remove them. And once they've stimulated the immune system, there's no easy way to unstimulate it. It is true there are immunosuppressant drugs that can dampen the entire immune system, but we have no way of picking out one response of the immune system, say to it, stop doing that particular antibody, for example.
I don't know if you're aware of a New Zealand court ruling. It was either April or May this year, and the judge deemed it problematic that the vaccine rollout was done on an entire population of New Zealand. And the judge was saying that a vaccine rollout, because they're in clinical trials, should only be done on a select group. And by logic, you cannot have the entire population be tested. So, at least one country has got these rulings saying that these vaccines are problematic, like the rollout of these vaccines are problematic.
Well, it would certainly make more sense, I think, to implement them with people who would be most likely to benefit, the most vulnerable, for example.
Yes.
The truth is, an awful lot of the population, probably the majority, including kids, for example, are likely to benefit very little directly from getting the vaccine themselves. And the problem is that some of these people who will benefit very little may well suffer some harm from serious side effects. I have a good friend of mine who has a medical condition which does not increase his risk of getting COVID or getting sick from COVID, but his medical condition could well be made worse by getting the vaccine. And studies have been done throughout the world that actually document that. So your question really, and the question that's probably critical to this discussion is, how much risk can society obligate an individual to accept in order to protect society? And that's a really difficult question. I don't have the answer for it, but I do know that we should be spending a lot more time having open, respectful, transparent dialogue of an ethical nature about that very question, because it's central to the issue of vaccines and vaccine mandates. For example, I don't want my grandchildren getting vaccinated with this vaccine for my benefit. In fact, I don't want them getting it at all until it's been better studied for a longer period of time to know its efficacy and safety for children.
Exactly. And that's the problem right now. They have been warp speeded. They've skipped the 10 to 15 years normal period in which the trials are done on a select group of individuals. Like you say, some could be children, some could be high risk, low risk, but you test it on that group to know if it's safe or efficient. And that's been skipped entirely, that they're rushing this, they're rolling these out. And so there's also evidence that these vaccines are waning, like the efficiency of them, that they're waning. And so what do I mean by that? Well, public health is now saying that because people are still getting sick and they're still transmitting COVID after they've been vaccinated, that these individual needs booster shots. And how many booster shots? And if you recall, nobody was told about the booster shots in the very beginning when they were talking about these vaccines. So the question is, are they effective or not?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are going to be people who get the vaccine who will benefit very little from these. Unlike seatbelts, where everyone who gets in a car accident will benefit from having a seatbelt.
Yes.
And seatbelts have been studied for decades. We've done very well at developing safe seatbelts. They have proven, hands down, that they provide more benefit than harm. But that has not been the case with the vaccines. We simply haven't studied them long enough to know all the benefits from them, all the harms from them, and how to balance them off. We simply haven't had enough time to do that the way we have with seatbelts, for example.
And people are equating the vaccine passports that they're asking people to have now to immunization records that you need for travel or children attending school. But are the ethics the same on those?
Well, let's take the childhood vaccination record or immunization record.
Okay.
There are similarities, but there are an awful lot of differences. First of all, the childhood immunization record doesn't actually record immunity. It just tells you you've received a vaccine. Now, it turns out that the classic vaccines tend to have a very high efficacy rate. But as we've seen, as you said earlier, we know that the vaccines against COVID have not been very efficacious. The efficacy has been waning within a matter of months, which is why we have the booster shots. And that's very different from the childhood vaccines, which are often good for life or good for many, many years. So essentially, I get the sense that we're vaccinating children not for their benefit, because the vaccines we give them are for their benefit. They actually get these diseases and they're quite serious. That's why we vaccinate them. But we're almost recommending the vaccines for COVID for children more to act more for our benefit, to almost act as human shields for us. And the truth is that in the original studies of the vaccines, children were purposely excluded from the studies. So we really don't have much information about the safety or efficacy of these vaccines in children. And that's very different from the decades and decades of well-illustrated efficacy and safety of the typical childhood vaccines.
I didn't realize, Barry, that children were excluded from the original trials about that. Usually people are excluded, or a class of the society are excluded for a reason, correct? So, it makes me nervous that there's a new technology. It makes me nervous that we're rolling it out. One size does not fit all, because every body is different. And we simply can't have the same confidence in these vaccines that we would have in a traditional vaccine sense.
Yeah, and normally with childhood vaccines, we allow for exemptions, either because of allergy, religious preference, other medical reasons, because every child is different. We don't treat children like sheep or cattle. They're unique. And so we allow for an exemption and we allow for an appeal process. Yes. And we don't use bribes, threats, coercion, shaming to get people to be vaccinated. We offer it to them, but we don't use those methods. I've never seen them used ever in medicine before, so I find it rather disturbing that we're using those. Also with the childhood vaccines, we've come to realize that there's a thing called herd immunity. So for those few children who, for whatever reason, don't get vaccinated, they will still get a lot of protection from herd immunity, because the amount of disease in the population will drop tremendously if most of the population is immune. And when children get the vaccines that we typically give them, we assume they're immune, and almost always they are. So we can count on herd immunity in a way that clearly we have not been counting on herd immunity when it comes to COVID at all. We see the efficacy waning over time, so the idea of herd immunity is frankly absurd now with the COVID vaccines. As well, there's been some concern that perhaps vaccinating during a pandemic for a virus that mutates a lot may actually increase the likelihood of mutants arising and variants arising. I'm not sure that's true, but it certainly is an interesting thought. So I think that before we want to routinely vaccinate children with these vaccines, we should recognize the significant differences between these vaccines and all the typical childhood vaccines. And we need some more intense ethical reflection before we make these equivalent to those vaccines.
Barry, I've really enjoyed our conversation on ethics, because it's been pretty intense. There's a lot of things to think about And you shared your perspectives that I've heard from the first time, actually, thinking about things from an ethical stance. I want to thank you for that. And
thank you, Paula.
Well, yeah, so thank you for sure. I want to say now that we have a better understanding of how the many ethical aspects of the pandemic have affected us, I'd like to explore vaccine mandates on the next conversation.
That sounds like a good progression, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, everybody.